Welcome, everyone. I haven't been to Antarctica, that's why I left New Jersey. So thank you for coming this morning. We are very, very pleased that you could join us. You're all very busy. This is obviously a very serious topic, and we're going to get to it. And I've been very, very fortunate over the last couple of years in doing the research I've been doing on homegrown extremism to meet a whole host of individuals who, as Frank mentioned, we call formers. We're going to talk about some work that we've done in the prisons as well, and folks that have come out. In fact, one of the reasons I'm going to France is I'm going to be getting together with a former there who was a jihadist who was actually a bomb maker and is now out giving lectures on why young men and women shouldn't do what they want to do in terms of getting recruited and radicalized. It's a small world. As the flyer mentioned, in June of 2003, Randall Todd Royer, who I knew as Randall at that time, is now known as Ismail, was indicted along with 10 other men on terrorism-related charges in connection with a group that they called the Virginia Jihad Network. I lectured about this group for years and knew Randall through what was written about him then, knew his other colleague, Ali Timony. They were linked to a foreign terrorist organization called Lashkar-e-Taiba, which operates in Pakistan and Kashmir. The men were recruited in the Washington, D.C. area. Some of you may have recalled they were paintballing at the time and training for things that they were going to be doing later on. And within a week of the attacks, 9/11, 4 of the defendants traveled to Pakistan and actually joined Lashkar-e-Taiba or LET. What makes this really interesting is that Ismail went in prison and all of these activities occurred with he and his colleagues, but he was born in Missouri. And I bring that up because many times as we're talking about terrorism, we often think about immigrants and refugees and faraway threat when in fact he's from the homeland. So the questions we want to ask him today is, how does this happen? Why would a young man who grows up in America's heartland decide to do something like this? And the other thing I'm going to mention is the power of social media. Christian Picciolini was here last year. Christian's a former neo-Nazi. He formed a group called Life After Hate. Believe it or not, we actually have a former neo-Nazi group that's global called Life After Hate. And I met Christian through Twitter. The irony of all this is that I met Ismail through Twitter. We started following each other, and then I got an email from him one day, and the next thing you know, we started talking, and he's going to be one of the subjects of a book that I'm working on right now that has a whole collection of formers in it. And I said, well, can we get you here? And fortunately, through my alma mater, the FBI, we were able to get him here. So we're very, very pleased to have him. So nothing's off limits today. We're going to have a conversation for the better part of about 40 minutes or so. And then I'm going to open it up to all of you for questions. And the one thing I will tell you about him, he's an extremely astute individual. He writes very, very well. If he lived closer to the West Coast, I'd have him here all the time. But the Georges, as we call it, George Washington, George Mason, and Georgetown, are hot on his heels, and so we got him first. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Ismail Royer. So I'm just going to start right in. We've talked a lot over the last several months, and I want everybody here to get an opportunity to sort of understand some of the things we talked about in the space of about an hour and some of the things you shared. But I want you to start at the beginning. We had some slides up here with photos of you throughout your life. And let's start with Missouri. Your parents, your school, your friends. What was it like there?
Well, I grew up in suburban St. Louis. It was a typical sort of lower middle class upbringing. My mother was Catholic, so I was raised a Catholic, went to Catholic schools, and went to church. One of the things that I can say about my parents and my upbringing that I think had an impact on my later development was the emphasis on helping people. My mother took in, kids who had AIDS. She was a public school teacher in the, inner city in St. Louis. My father volunteered in homeless shelters, that sort of thing. So I think that I was raised with this, sort of ethic to help people, and that's what I, attribute. I mean, I love that about my parents, that they raised me that way. I mean, they just continue to be fundamentally good people, and unfortunately, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, as we'll talk about, I think. Yeah.
So one of the other things we talked about is early on in that childhood and going through your K through 12 years, you did run into some folks that, let's just say we didn't call them that at the time, but they were extremists.
Well, yeah, I eventually in my early teens, through the venue of punk rock music and that movement, got involved in left-wing causes. I became very upset about United States policy in Central America as I understood it through the lens of far left, newspapers, and now looking back at it, I see that I really didn't have a very good handle on what was actually going on. But anyway, I was very upset about the Vietnam War, the Iran-Contra thing, the first Gulf War. These are all things that I was involved in, protesting, attending. Protests that turned into riots in Oregon and St. Louis and places like that. So then the Rodney King riots happened, and that, as a person who was very, very concerned with issues of racism and social injustice, these causes and these concerns, I think, led me to believe that extreme measures were needed to address these extreme problems. And I think that that's a recurring theme and one of the key pathways to extremism, is that sense, that feeling.
And so you converted around age 19.
Yes.
So how did that happen, and why did that happen?
Well, it was really a combination of two things. One is that, by that time I had been really an atheist, for a while, because my following of Marxist style ideology and the belief that religion is the opium of the masses and that type of thing. But I started to feel like there was something missing in my life. There was some sort of spiritual hole there. And I also began to read Malcolm X's work, and particularly his autobiography, in the course of my study of the civil rights movement. And I saw him discussing Islam and Sunni Islam as opposed to the Nation of Islam and the more, racialist aspects there. And so I began to see Islam as sort of as sort of an option for me to sort of address the social, the spiritual hole that I felt, but at the same time, Islam as presented by Malcolm X and the understanding of it in the early 90s that was prevalent was that Islam was sort of as well as sort of a social justice movement or ideology, which, as I'll talk about, I hope I'll get a chance to talk about, I think is a very, very bad way to look at any religion. And C.S. Lewis actually discussed that in the Screw Tape Letters about how this is actually a trap of the devil to make people approach religion as a social justice movement. Even though Islam does, as hopefully we'll talk about, does want to see fairness and justice in the world, but to approach it from that direction is certainly a pathway towards extremism.
So after your conversion, who were the folks that you were around most often helping you understand Islam?
I had a lot of competing voices in my head, and a lot of things that I was reading, but I can say that I didn't really have a particularly, I didn't have an exposure to extremism early on. I didn't really have that. In our mosque, it was fairly mainstream, immigrant, Pakistanis mostly. But at the same time, there were things that were in the air. The Afghan war, this was 1992, so the Afghan war was just starting to subside and turn into a civil war. So there was this sort of, romanticism about the mujahideen fighting in Afghanistan that sort of permeated the air. And the Afghan war, the Afghan Jihad, the first war, was much different than what morphed later into ISIS and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, which we can, I guess, talk about. But there was that feeling of people fighting for Islam, for the oppressed Muslims, that was sort of in the air. And I did imbibe that, I think, and that did color my religion. But one thing that I can say is that I never, unfortunately, and this is very important, I did not, no one ever stopped me to say, listen, Islam is a faith, and Islam is first and foremost, like all religions, a relationship between the creation and the creator. Rather, I continued to be sort of focused on Islam as a social justice movement, and that never gave me the spiritual grounding that would have allowed me to weigh, in the future, the sort of, other messages that I was getting.
Right. And so we're talking about a time, it's the 1991, 92, even though we've all got the internet and we've got cell phones, it's not certainly to where it is today, where we talk about online connectivity and in some cases online radicalization. What was the push-pull factor for you that led to eventually going off to Bosnia?
Well, for me, we had in St. Louis, St. Louis ultimately became one of the largest, came to have the largest population of Bosnian refugees, in the United States. So, or at least one of them, and so working at the, hanging out at the mosque a lot, I began to volunteer with Bosnian refugees to help them resettle, and because there was this refugee resettlement agency in St. Louis. So I started volunteering with them and the mosque to help take Bosnian refugees to their doctor's appointments, help them get food stamps, move furniture for them, find donated furniture and stuff like that. And so through that process, I began to talk with them and to hear what was happening in their country. So, and likewise, I was following the news. I was always a big, follower of the news, so, trying to analyze what was going on in the world. And so I started reading a lot about the Bosnian genocide. And I began to really, really feel very upset about what was happening in Bosnia. I felt, it sort of began to consume me, the sort of suffering that they were going through. And I made the determination that I would go over there to help somehow or another, And my initial feeling was that I was going to go do some relief work or something like that, even though I had no experience in that sort of thing. But I just wanted to go do something. And a friend of mine said to me, hey, there are foreign fighters over there fighting, foreign mujahideen fighting in Bosnia. And that planted the idea in my head that, hey, maybe I'll go join that war. Maybe I'll go join. So I wound up getting a connection to a friend of mine, a refugee friend of mine's family in Slovenia, the former Yugoslav Republic, where a lot of Bosnian refugees were. And I traveled to Slovenia with the intention of going to Bosnia to try to do whatever, some ambiguous, nebulous thing to help, And when I was there, I told my friend's mother and family that I wanted to go help in Bosnia, maybe to do some refugee work, or maybe to join the army. Well, what they did was they found a bus going to Bosnia, and they told the bus driver, "Hey, help our friend here. He wants to go to Bosnia and he wants to join the army." But they didn't say anything about the refugee work, the relief work. So when the bus got to Bosnia, the bus driver took me personally to the headquarters of a Bosnian Army brigade and told them this guy wants to join the army. And in my mind, I was like, maybe it's now getting real, And I think that the military thing was really just something that I was saying to myself. It wasn't something that I really, was convinced about, But now it appeared that my decision had kind of been made, and at that point I couldn't really back out. I felt like, that at that point I was kind of in the pipeline. They took me and sent me to to a training camp for the Bosnian military, and yeah.
So let me hold you there.
Yeah.
While you were doing this, and as you made the decision to go,
Yeah.
where were your parents and friends in this conversation, if at all?
Well, I was in D.C. at the time. I moved from St. Louis to Washington, D.C. to go to school at American University,
Okay.
where I studied, majored in government. And so I wasn't really having a lot of conversations with my parents about this because I was outside of the city. And the conversations I was having with my friends, most of them really were telling me don't go.
Really?
Yeah. And I had a friend who was a Serb, who was, I considered, an ally and a friend because he was against what the Serbian government was doing, the Yugoslav government was doing. But anyway, he was telling me, look, he's trying to be the voice of reason. Look, I feel you, I understand you. I'm against it as well, but this is not the way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting yourself in over your head. And there was nothing. This is the interesting thing, is really that there was nothing that anyone could have told me. As a matter of fact, the more people tried to tell me that, the more I felt like now this is something I have to do. And anyway, when I got there, and now I'm being shuttled around from military facility to military facility, and the foreign fighters in Bosnia really mostly, for the most part, were Arabs.
Mm-hmm.
So I found myself in a training camp with Arabs, mostly from Yemen and Saudi Arabia, and eventually landed with a group called Abu Zubair, which is it was a group of Gulf Arabs that had been in Tajikistan, and prior to that had been in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
So the people that I was with were veterans of the Afghan and Tajik wars, and most of them had been students in the Islamic universities in Saudi Arabia.
So you were there how long?
I was there for 6 months. I got there at the beginning of the winter of '94, '95. I stayed there, went through, the training camps, and then was assigned to various front lines and, participated in some battles, mainly that were, to defend hills and mountains and things that had been seized from the Serbs in operations. And then our group was brought in to hold those while the Serbs tried to take them back. So that went on for about 6 months, and then the Dayton. It's a little bit of just to make a long story short, the Serbs committed the genocide in Srebrenica, which brought the United States and the European Union to kind of a red line. I mean, they were under a lot of pressure to end the war after the Srebrenica massacre, which occurred while I was there. And then the last straw was a Serbian attack on an open-air market in Sarajevo, which I actually happened to be right next to when it happened. And I have a lot of photographs of it. I didn't bring them, but I've got them, and I'll post them on my website eventually in a photo essay. But I have photographs of the aftermath of this slaughter, blood running in the streets and stuff. So I woke up, I was on leave in Sarajevo at the time. I was not actually stationed in Sarajevo, but I was on leave in Sarajevo when this attack occurred. And I was, sitting in my apartment that I was in when all of a sudden just this massive explosion happened, and almost like the windows almost broke from this,
Mm-hmm.
So I immediately called a Turkish journalist who I had met there, a friend of mine, and I asked him, I said, "What did you hear that? What was that?" And he said, "I don't know, I think it must have been the Serbs." And I said, "No, that wasn't the Serbs. They don't have stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
And I turned on the TV and saw that it was actually the United States bombing the Serbs around Sarajevo. And this went on for a while, and I can tell you that the mood in Sarajevo was very happy about this, and even we, the Arabs, which I consider myself at the time part of, were actually overjoyed at the United States intervening on the behalf of the Bosnians. But then it became clear that what the United States wanted was for the war to end, and the international community wanted the war to end. And so that was also, there was mixed feelings about that, because it really froze the front lines at their place. It didn't allow, the Bosnians were not allowed to continue, anyway, that's a long story, but sorry. I can go on and on.
It's a very interesting story.
Yeah.
We've got the detail for the book research.
Right.
So how did you find your way back to the United States? And when you got back here, what did you do?
Well, the interesting thing is that when the war was over, when it was clear that the war was over, the Arabs that I was with, and also, there were other people there, French converts to Islam, North Africans, Turks, the conversation was, well, where are we going to go now?
Right.
You know what I mean? Where are we going to fight now? Because there was the people there saw themselves as sort of an international foreign legion of Muslims, and as we were talking about earlier, it really has to be understood that right now we're seeing the jihad movement through the lens of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. At that time, that strand was not as prevalent, although it existed, but it wasn't as prevalent. And so at that time, it wasn't so much, let's go blow things up. It was more like, what's the next hot spot that we can go and defend Muslims, where we globally. So some people went to, Burma. Some people went to Djibouti, of all places. I had friends who died in Djibouti. I found about later. And I don't even know what that was. Actually, I don't even. Mali and joining the Tuareg. Rebellion against the Malian government. Chechnya, where a lot of the people that I was with went to Chechnya via Turkey. So I personally felt like it was time for me to go back home to America because I missed my family and I missed my mom and dad. And a friend of mine, a French convert to Islam, asked me, "Well, why are you going back to that devilish place?" That exact friend later died in Ethiopia in a meaningless cause. So anyway, I came back to America. But when I came back to America, it was very strange because I was now like going from a level of existence that was, it's very hard to explain because, first of all, I felt, in that war, I felt like I was participating in something very meaningful.
Absolutely.
I was defending, innocent people against genocide. I had, every moment of my life was, deeply important and meaningful. And then I came back to America, went back to American University, and I'm sitting in, classes, a poetry class where the professor's talking about the feminist interpretation of, Walt Whitman, and it was very difficult to relate. It was very difficult to relate. Where only literally a month before I had had mortars falling around my head. So and even the Arabs, the Muslims that I was with, had a hard time. I had a hard time relating to. For example, and with the Arabs that I was with, the way we used to communicate with each other because of the circumstances that we were on, the way we interacted was, we'd greet each other, ya ayuni, ya qalbi, like, oh my beloved, my dear heart. This was how we communicated with each other. Well, when I came back and I was just doing the same thing. And someone came to me and said, Ismail, there's a rumor that you're a homosexual because of the way that you're talking with people. So I was kind of, it was kind of weird, and so I had a hard time even relating to other Muslims because I saw other Muslims as being kind of, worldly now, and they were pursuing their petty, lives, and of course that's real life, that's normal life that human beings engage in. But to me, it was hard to sort of, come back down to that level, to decompress, really, and so I felt like, I wanted to go off again and, recapture that, sense of adventure and that sense of meaning, I don't regret having been involved in the Bosnian War because, in retrospect, it really was a very important, I think it was a very, it was something akin to World War II and the fight against Nazis, But the problem with it is that, I spent the rest of, I spent the next 15 years trying to recapture that and, getting involved in dubious, to say the least, causes as a result.
Yeah, so let's, Frank, can we grab some water?
I got
It's right
no,
next to
Oh, you got it? Okay, never mind.
Thank you.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
I just want to make sure you had it.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's talk about, as we've done before, your 9/11 feelings and your
Right.
immediate post 9/11, because that was a pivotal moment
Right, yeah.
in your process.
Yeah, I mean, I was, to be clear, and this has to be understood, I never really saw myself prior, like around the time of Bosnia and after that, to be anti-American. I was not involved with a movement that was, or let's say a mindset that was of, let's blow up innocent people. And, we never, that was not the school of thought that I was involved in. But at the same time, so, to illustrate this through the timeline of events, when the war in Kosovo started happening, and this was about 1998 when Milosevic began the suppression of the independence movement in Kosovo, I said to myself, aha, here is another Bosnia. Here now I can go off and recapture this, this mythical, feeling that I had. And I went to that, and I went to actually travel to Macedonia to try to, join the Kosovo Liberation Army and fighting against, the Serbs, but was disappointed because I found that the KLA was actually a Leninist movement, and they were, very, very opposed to any religious Muslims coming from outside. In reality, at that point, it wasn't really that unreasonable for them not to want to get involved with, these foreign fighters. You know what I mean? I mean, as I see it now, because it's really kind of a can of worms. And then when the war in Chechnya happened, a friend of mine and I decided we were going to go to Chechnya, and this friend of mine actually is in prison right now as part of my case. He wound up becoming one of my co-defendants. So we decided we would go to Chechnya, but he learned, he's from Yemen, my friend Ibrahim Al-Hamdi. Yeah, he decided that he would, he found out that he needed to get military training and that the Chechens would not accept us without military training. Well, I'd already been in Bosnia, so I didn't need it. But we determined that what we do is try to get him training with Lashkar-e-Taiba in Kashmir, and that was how I even thought about first going to Kashmir. So we got plane tickets and got ready to go to Pakistan, but it turned out, had a problem getting the visa because his father was the vice ambassador of Yemen to the United States, and they wouldn't. He was on a diplomatic passport, and the Pakistanis wouldn't give him a visa without a letter from his embassy, which was, kind of. He didn't really want to explain why he needed such a letter, and so he wound up not being able to go at that time. Well, I had a plane ticket, so I was like, well, I'll just go to Kashmir. So I flew to Pakistan. Lashkar-e-Taiba had some connections with the mujahideen that I was involved with in Bosnia a few years earlier, so they were able to call some people and find out that I was a legitimate person. He could vouch for me, so they vouched for me. And Lashkar-e-Taiba saw me as, a valuable, recruit because I'm a white American, and they took me to their training camps, showed me their training camps. I went to the front line. And the interesting thing, if people are not familiar with Lashkar-e-Taiba, they're essentially a wing of the Pakistani military intelligence. So, when I went to the front lines in Kashmir, I was going to Pakistani military positions. LAT had, military-issued ID cards that they would wave, to get through military checkpoints. They had license plates issued by the Pakistani military. And, when I got to the front lines, I was greeted by a colonel, Pakistani colonel in the military who was speaking to me in Bosnian. He said, and I spoke to him back in Bosnia. So here's a white American speaking to a Pakistani military colonel in Bosnian, And I asked him, how do you speak Bosnian? And he said, I was part of the UN brigade in Pakistani brigade in Bosnia, So anyway, I fired some anti-aircraft weapons across the front lines at Indian positions, asking if I could do that, and they said sure. And these were Pakistani military weapons that I was firing, just sort of for as I saw it, for fun, for fun, and and I mean, see, what I want to make clear, and I think this is really important, is that or I hope this comes true, is that if you see like every step in this process that led me from there, St. Louis and punk rocker, Randy Royer, to Supermax prison in ADX in Colorado, to here. Every single step of the way did not seem that drastic of a step.
Right.
You know what I mean? It always seemed like sort of, oh, well, maybe I'll just do this, and maybe I'll just do this, and maybe I'll just do that. And it kind of led me, and at a certain point, really it's where I was, when I was sitting in the holding cell in the courthouse, and I'm sitting there saying to myself, how did I get here? You know what I mean? Like, I'm in court, and it's United States versus Randall Royer. Please come to order, and that's when it really hit me. Is like, I'm really out on a limb here. And anyway, so that's what led me to Kashmir, and I saw Lashkar-e-Taiba. I asked them. At that point, I was actually very opposed to Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. So I asked them. When I got there, I said, what is your position on Al-Qaeda? What's your position on the embassy bombings? Because the embassy bombings which had occurred a couple years before I went there, I was really disgusted by, and I kind of saw that group as being a sort of an aberration or a sect against what I had stood for. So they told me, and they assured me that they were against bin Laden, and I don't want to delve into this. This involves sort of the nuances of Islamic theology. It involves nuances of contemporary Islamist movements. It involves, but Pakistan is divided into different, let's say like ideological schools of thought, and one of those is the so-called Ahl al-Hadith, which is aligned historically with the ulama or scholars of Saudi Arabia, so the establishment scholars. So these establishment scholars had issued fatwas against bin Laden, and since this group that I was with, Lashkar-e-Taiba, was following that school of thought, they were consequently against bin Laden. So I was writing news releases for them condemning bin Laden, which are actually available online. That's one of the things that I did for Lashkar-e-Taiba, was that I did a lot of their internet. This was 2000, so I was kind of an early adopter of the internet and of using the internet to promote jihadist movements.
So let me ask you this, because this seems to be a commonality. Omar Hamami, when he left Alabama to join al-Shabaab, became one of their, I'll call propagandists.
Right.
Samir Khan from New York ended
Right.
up being the editor-in-chief of Inspire magazine for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula.
Right.
And they used you in that same way. Was it
That's
because you were an
Yeah.
American?
Yeah, because I was American, because I was savvy with the internet, because I was, I spoke English. I mean, what I would do, one of the things that I would do is they would give me their battle reports of different, operations that they had conducted against the Indian military, and I would convert their, English, their attempts at English into polished, American English, and I'm a very, to toot my own horn, I'm a very good writer, so I would convert these things, and these things eventually were used as evidence against me, in my criminal case. But I eventually abandoned the idea of going to Chechnya and just started focusing on Lashkar-e-Taiba. When it comes to the issue of Kashmir, I kind of, at this point I was older than, I went to I turned 21 in Bosnia in the middle of the war, so, at this point I was probably 27 or 28, and I sort of, it began to dawn on me that this was not, Bosnia, and that the Kashmir issue was not Bosnia. And I probably wasn't going to find another sort of romantic dream adventure like Bosnia again. But at the same time, I kind of said, well, it's still pretty cool. They've got these training camps. They had Lashkar-e-Taiba was very interesting because their methodology was to promote their training camps as sort of a jihad tourism. They had lower level training camps that were not really their purpose was not really to prepare people for jihad, but rather it was just sort of to bring people, kind of like dude ranches almost, where you could go and shoot a gun a few times and, go, hiking in the Himalayas. But what its real purpose was to propagandize for Lashkar-e-Taiba, and if people, and it was also sort of a way for them to look and see who was really serious or not, and then they would bring them to higher level training camps if they identified people who were actually really serious, So it was a way of gathering a large crop of people, and if they wound up not pursuing it, they would still be beneficial to LET because they would go back to where they came from and encourage people to go, and also it spread the word about their movement and about their activities. So, I enthusiastic participant in that aspect of it, and that, well, hey, I came back to the United States and I, began telling my group of friends, hey, if you guys want to go train, if you guys want to go hang out with real mujahideen, if you want to, go and hike in the Himalayas and shoot guns, here's this group. And I had a group of, I think it has to be really understood how important the issue of Chechnya was at that time. People were very, very, even ordinary people in the mosques were very upset about the Russian invasion of Chechnya. They were very interested in what was going on, and so a lot of the young people were, were following it very closely. And so there were, and by the way, this has a lot. There's a very big role here that was being played by the internet in a rudimentary fashion at that time, because even though not everyone was on the internet and it was all dial-up and stuff, but at the time you had Azam publications, which was very critical in spreading the word and sort of like winding up the Muslim communities in the English-speaking Muslim communities about what was going on in Chechnya, which is not to say that the issue of Chechnya did not involve important things, but as we'll get to, there's a theme here, which is that extremists, what's critical for them is to use real issues. Like right now, the Rohingya in, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, in Myanmar, or Syria or Iraq, we're using real issues, Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, to really enhance and inflame the sense of humiliation, oppression, and then use those feelings to manipulate people into what they want to do. So this was going on, and I think we were very upset about, or very interested in the Chechnya thing. And so what I was doing was I was telling people, look, even if you don't want to fight in Kashmir, and I didn't want to fight in Kashmir. This wasn't something that I wanted to give my life for. But even if you don't want to fight in Kashmir, at least go there and go get training so that you can be ready in case something happens. Right. In case you're called up to go to Chechnya, or in case something jumps off in Bosnia again, or whatever. And so that was what our paintball playing was about. Ultimately, what we were indicted on. Well, we were indicted on at least 6 different conspiracies, and then many weapons charges. But some of the 2 of the conspiracies involved the Neutrality Act, which is a 1786 law, that criminalizes getting involved in conflicts in which the United States is neutral. So technically, it was one of the conspiracies was conspiracy to set on foot a military expedition against a friendly nation, i.e., India, and then another one was Russia. So that was part of what was underlying the weapons charges in our case. So we have India, we have Russia. Now, this was all pre-9/11. Right. Okay, and then we can get into what happened after 9/11.
So let's do this in the interest of time, because I know there's something that you and I talked about that I want to share with people. You did wind up in Supermax.
Yeah.
I believe in the first 10 years of your sentence, you were in 7 different institutions?
Yeah, well, in the almost 14, I was in 7
different institutions.
Yeah.
But I want you to share with our audience today some of the individuals. First of all, let's talk about that experience, especially Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, et cetera.
Right.
I also want to talk about who was at Supermax, who everybody knows and you know.
Yeah.
So,
well, I was, for 2.5 years, I was in...
And tell them where it is, because many people don't know.
For 2.5 years, I was in ADX, which is stands for administrative maximum. It's the Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. It's the highest security prison in the United States, and it's solitary confinement in most of it. There's a section of it that's less restrictive, which I was in for a year, but for a year and a half I was in solitary confinement there. By the way, for another year I was in solitary confinement in other prisons.
And I'll never forget one of the first phone conversations we had, and he was recommending books to me, and he said, you find a lot of time to read when you spend 23 hours a day in a cell by yourself for a long time.
Yeah, so in ADX, some of my neighbors were, Terry Nichols from the Oklahoma City bombing, Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, and by the way, I have a stack of correspondence between me and Richard Reed debating Al-Qaeda, debating extremism and that sort of thing, and I have it all in PDF, and I intend to prepare to do a book on that, and with annotations to explain what some of these esoteric concepts that we're talking about. So anyway, the Unabomber, Eric Rudolph, the 1996 Atlanta Olympics bomber.
Ted Kaczynski.
Ted Kaczynski was there. Ted Kaczynski is the Unabomber. Eric Rudolph was the Atlanta Olympics bomber. And so, along with a host of other, Ahmed Rassam, who I got to know very well in ADX.
For those of you who don't know, Ahmed Rassam was the Algerian who came down from Canada and was caught at the border, who was going to blow up LAX on the Millennium Plot.
Right, and I had a lot of very interesting conversations with him about how he himself was radicalized, and he's very bitter about that towards Al-Qaeda, and he explained a lot to me about how they got him, actually.
So tell me how you, a white Muslim convert, survived in those institutions.
Well, for 7.5 years of the nearly 14 years I was in prison, and I just got out in December, by the way. For 7.5 of those years, I was in various terrorism units, lockdown units. 2.5 years of those, I said, it was in ADX. The other parts of that time I was in what are called communication management units. There are two of them. One is in Terre Haute, Indiana, in the federal prison there, and the other one is in the federal penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. So in those places, it's different than being in a regular prison population, and the sort of issues that I had to deal with were different. In the CMUs, the communication management units, most of the people in there were in there with terrorism cases. Really we didn't have the same dynamic with the sort of Aryan Brotherhood, prison gang, racial tensions and stuff. There are many, many other issues going on in those units, which we can talk about if we have time. But now ADX was, although there were a lot of people there with terrorism cases, there were also a lot of very high-level criminals there and prisoners, a lot of gang members. And so there I really, really had a tough time with the whole racial dynamic. And, of course, in the lockdown part of it, no one can get at anyone, so there's no, risk of anything. But, to get out of ADX, you have to go through the step-down program. The step-down program is an area of the prison where you come out of the prison, out of your cell for about 4 hours a day and mingle with other people, and so that is actually the extremely violent unit, and I had a lot of difficulties and a lot of problems, to say the least. Being white, being Muslim, having a terrorism case. I mean, in prison, Islam is seen as a racial gang, So, a lot of people saw me, a lot of the white people there saw me as a race traitor more than anything. I mean, and then a lot of the African American prison Muslims looked at me as being sort of a kind of like the same thing as like a white guy trying to be a Crip or something. That's how they saw it. So, it was, I was really in a very strange position, and it was very dangerous, and I to be honest, it's only through God's help that I escaped that alive. In fact, I was, a witness to a very brutal attempted murder that I thought was going to be directed at me, but at the last moment, it appears that they changed the victim to someone else. So, and that's a long story, but suffice to say, every morning that I woke up and the doors opened, I had to be standing at the door with my shoes on, ready to go,
Right.
and expecting that this might
Might
be the last day.
time.
Yeah.
So let's talk about, before we open this up, your route out of extremism and the movement, and how
Well,
did that happen?
look, it's a great question, and I think that there are a lot of nuances here. As I was saying, I think that my particular journey was different than sort of the ISIS type of radicalization that we're familiar with. But at the same time, not, obviously still problematic, and prior to 9/11, I was sort of in a militant mindset, I think is certainly fair to say, and, looking for some noble conflict to be involved in, and at the same time also, even though I didn't really have the idea of being at war with the United States or something like that, but I still kind of had this mindset of an us versus them, sort of Muslims versus non-Muslims sort of mentality, and when 9/11 happened, I was given, first of all, I was in D.C. and I'm seeing the Pentagon burning every day as I'm driving to work. I'm driving past it. There were soldiers on the streets. There were, the FBI was all over, the Muslim community, for very understandable reasons. But at the same time, I started feeling like I was under siege, and having the background that I had and the mentality that I was already in, I saw the world as suddenly being polarized. And even though I was not in any way for 9/11, and there are newspaper articles out there where I was condemning it, because at the time I was a spokesperson for an Islamic activist group. At the same time, I felt like, well, okay, even though I was against that, the world is now divided into two camps. And who am I with? Well, I'm with the Muslims. And so I, as anyone who's familiar with my case can read, I decided that I would help people go to Kashmir to be with the mujahideen, to be with the Muslims, and I helped people go who I knew, at least partly, had the desire to go to Afghanistan to fight the United States to defend the Taliban. Even though I wasn't a huge fan of the Taliban, again, I still saw the world as being polarized. And yes, I don't agree with everything. And this is what I think has to be really emphasized, which is that, one of I think the big lie, and the way that extremists, people who burn people alive and cut off heads, the way they're able to get people who are maybe not against that, who are sort of fence sitters, is to say, look, you may not agree with, every aspect of our, of what we do, that's just hair splitting. Those are things that scholars can debate about whether or not those things are, ultimately in the end, the real question is, where does your loyalty lie? And if your doesn't lie with the Muslims, even with Muslims you disagree with, then you have to question whether you're really a Muslim at all.
Right.
And if it doesn't lie with us and the Muslims, even though you may disagree with us, if your loyalty does not lie with us, then you're an apostate, and you're not a real Muslim. So this is a mentality that I think I fell for. Even though ISIS didn't exist at the time, but this was Al-Qaeda's message. And this is, by the way, this is the message this is the methodology that they propagate in their own strategies, strategy manuals, like the Management of Savagery, which people may have heard of. They promote this idea that they say, our goal is to provoke Western military intervention in the Muslim world in order to drive a wedge between the Muslims and the non-Muslims, in order to drive them into our arms. And this is their primary goal in conducting these terrorist attacks. The ISIS and Al-Qaeda's primary goal in conducting attacks on the United States is to provoke military intervention. They don't imagine that they're going to have some sort of, normally when you think of military operations, they're to have some sort of military outcome. We're going to destroy this battle group over here or something like that. That's not what they're trying to do with these type of attacks. What they're trying to do with these type of attacks is to drive a wedge between the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world and the Western world, and to drive Muslims into their arms. They're trying to create alienation on the part of Muslims living in the West, and to try to, what they call, eliminate the gray zone, to prevent coexistence between Muslims and non-Muslims. And yeah, so I think that what happened with me, you asked me, how did I de-radicalize? Well,
Or disengage.
disengage. Well, what happened is that, for that brief period after 9/11, where I was saying, oh, well, I guess I have to be with, this is where my loyalty lies.
Mm-hmm.
What I did was, I flew to Bosnia, where I had very deep connections. I'd fought there, and my wife, I'd married my wife there shortly after the war. I had, my in-laws were there. I had a lot of friends who had, former military in Bosnia. I went there, and when I got to Bosnia, and this is now a week after 9/11, I got out, got off the bus in Zenica, where my wife and in-laws were from, and I saw some friends who had been with the Bosnian contingent of the mujahideen, and they saw me and said, Ismail, what are you doing here in Bosnia? And I explained, oh, well, we have to be for the, we have to be with the Muslims, and they said, whoa, hold on a minute, come on, let's have some coffee. And they sat down with me and they talked to me and they said, look, first of all, this guy who advised you to go, is he going to go too?
Mm-hmm.
Is he going to go? Is he going to leave? In fact, no. I mean, I started feeling kind of silly, because we had been advised, well, you need to leave the country, you need to go be with the mujahideen. And this Ali Tamimi, and he never, he didn't, And look, I don't believe that Ali Tamimi needs to have life in prison, but at the same time, he gave us phenomenally poor advice, and definitely, I think all of us behaved very stupidly, and so so my friends in Bosnia advised me that, one of the key things that they said to me was, look, these people, bin Laden and them, didn't ask us in Bosnia if this would be good for the Muslims in Bosnia that they attack, the World Trade Center in New York, and the Pentagon. They didn't ask us. In fact, this is going to have a horrible effect on the Muslims here, And so when I started to see that, that's exactly right. These people, the message that they were giving me was, they made their bed, let them lie in it.
Right.
We don't have it. This is actually one of the guys, and the person who said this to me was the head of the Bosnian Mujahideen's Dawah department. Mm-hmm. Dawah means calling to Islam, during the war. And now at that time, he ran a very influential magazine, Islamic magazine in Bosnia. He said, look, if I rob a bank, and then I call you and say, hey, Ismail, the cops have the place surrounded. I need you. It's your duty to come and help me. What are you going to say? I'm going to say, well, that's on you, man. He said, that's exactly what, it doesn't matter. They can't claim Islamic solidarity, when they do something that's going to harm the rest of the Muslims. And I think that's what reached me, and I immediately saw the stupidity of of my mindset. And that's what, that's the message that needs to be given to anyone who's, might be inclined towards that sort of mentality, which is that these people are not your champions. Mm-hmm. These people are actually deliberately bringing harm to the Muslim world in order to manipulate people like you,
Excellent. I want to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to open it up. We talked about a gentleman that I know who lives in Northern California. He was in a New York Times op-ed piece. Yeah. And he talked about having the notion that his son was radicalized.
Right.
Called the FBI. Cut to the chase, his son was much further along the radicalization path than we thought, and now he's facing prosecution. And the gentleman told me, he said, if I had known what I know now, I would have never called the FBI. What do you tell that parent? What do you tell that friend? What do you tell that relative who thinks that they have someone, whether it's extremist Islam or someone who's going to be a skinhead or a neo-Nazi or anti-government?
Right.
What do you tell that person today when they say to you, I think I know someone that's on that path? What do you say to them?
Well, there's not a simple answer to this question. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I can say is that you have, people, I would ask them, first of all, how far along is this person?
Right.
You know, where is this person in the stage of becoming, you know, inflamed over, over the grievances that are going on, or has this person advanced to the stage of now he's decided that something has to be done about it, you know?
Right.
And the second thing that I would ask is, and this is something that I didn't get into much, but maybe we can get into later, but there are different pathways towards, extremism and extremist violence. And one of the ways is what we've talked about, this sort of sense of something has to be done about this horrible situation and this humiliation and oppression that's going on.
A sense of altruism.
A sense of, yeah. But there are other pathways towards that, and one of the ways towards that is a sort of defective personality, a sort of narcissism, a sort of sense of grievance, alienation, even sometimes just a desire to hurt people, And this is another way to extremism, and that's much tougher to deal with, because these kind of people have actually like defects in their character and they can't be talked out of that. Those are things that require almost, a different type of doctoring of the soul. Yeah, exactly. And then you have another pathway, and I've encountered this a lot, which is, people on the autism spectrum have a tendency to see the world in black and white and become monomaniacally fixated on things. And so I've dealt with, and these people may need medication. So these are different routes, but I want to address this notion of, well, I wish I hadn't called the FBI or something. I think that the FBI is in a tough position, and the government is in general is in a tough position. Law enforcement is when it comes to this, because we don't have preventive detention in the United States. You can't say, this guy's starting to talk crazy, let's lock him up and try to incapacitate him so he doesn't hurt himself or others, while we can try to talk him down, and have others come and talk him down. The FBI and law enforcement can really just, I think, go and sometimes talk to someone like that and try to spook them into, oh, maybe I need to pump the brakes, or on the other hand, one of the options that they use are the sting operations, which themselves are problematic. I mean, look, I'm not going to say that I don't understand why that takes place. It is sort of a type of, preventive detention to say, let's kind of nudge, perhaps, and not in a way that, like, no entrapment defense has yet worked, in court, But at the same time, I think there are ethical difficulties with this. But I think that what the FBI is trying to do is to try to shut someone down before they go operational, even though they may not ever go operational without that little bit of nudging. Now, so this is very difficult. But one thing I can say, and this is what I told Richard Reed. I told Richard Reed, look, if I had known about what you were planning to do before you got on the plane with that bomb in your shoe, I would have broken your legs or something, to try to stop you, So, and that was for your own good. So someone who laments the fact that the FBI has locked someone up who was, considering going on some sort of spree or going operational, really has to understand that, yes, even though it's terrible to have, and look, I spent a lot of time in prison, and I don't wish prison on anyone, but at the same time, it's really often for their own good. I mean, this father, and I don't know his son's situation, and I don't know him, but, his son would probably feel a lot worse if his son had gone off and
I mean, I've talked to parents in Minneapolis who were in the trial last spring, who, although their sons now are looking at 10 to 15 years, said they're still alive.
Right, they're still alive, and they didn't hurt anyone.
Right,
They didn't hurt
and
themselves.
to your point about the FBI, what's really challenging today is that the number of people the FBI has talked to that later on, years later, do go operational. Omar Mateen in Orlando, Florida, Tamlin Tsarnaev, Boston, and people wonder, well, why didn't you guys catch these people? Well, at some point, if they're not doing anything to suggest they're going to go operational, that case is closed.
Right.
And that's what happened in the case of those two individuals. So your point is well taken.
But there's no question that there needs to be, right now there's the whole, countering violent extremism notion has come under a lot of fire, and I definitely, think that the critics have a point, but the thing is that there has to be some, I mean, the Muslim community sees this as some sort of attempt to sort of securitize, intelligence. But I think that at the same time, the Muslim community has a very deep interest in creating an off-ramp for people who, might be inclined to do something crazy, or even if they don't do something crazy, just to have a misunderstanding of the religion, So they have a very deep interest in that, and I think that the Muslim community, one way or another, would benefit from having some sort of counseling available. That if the law enforcement becomes aware of someone who's talking crazy, that they can refer them, to the Muslim community to try to talk them down, because it's only going to be community-based efforts like that are going to be able to have credibility and be effective with these sort of people.
And so what I'm going to say on that note is that here in Los Angeles, through the mayor's office, we are working on a portal that's going to provide those kinds of resources.
Right.
One end of the spectrum of counseling to the other end of the spectrum of law enforcement and prosecution if that's what's necessary.
Right.
So hopefully we'll be one of those pilots you talk about.
Yeah, and as far as I understand, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn, I think, or in New York somewhere is doing something similar. Yeah, something similar.
So let's open this up. I think we have a mic back there, and if you'll bring it up here to the front row, please, to Ms. Applebaum. And thank you. Okay, Jackie, it's yours.
Thank you. I have a question. How did your travels get financed?
Well, that's a great question. My grandmother was very wealthy, and she passed away and left me some money, so I used that. Other sources of finance were, and I don't know if I should mention this because I will. No, that's okay. When I left from American University to go to Bosnia, I went to Turkey first, and I spent a long time with the movement of Fethullah Gulen in Turkey, which is in the news because they were the people who were involved in the coup against President Erdogan, and this movement, they gave me, it's not to what extent it's extreme or whatever is a different issue, but they gave me a lot of money to go on to Bosnia, and so I spent actually Ramadan of 1994 with them in Istanbul and Izmir. So I got a lot of money from them. Now, when I went to Kashmir, the person who financed that was my co-defendant Ibrahim al-Hamdi, who was fairly wealthy, his father being a Yemeni official. So just sort of, and then when you get to these places, they take it from there. You know what I mean? Like Lashkar-e-Taiba, I left Pakistan with more money than I had when I got there.
Wow.
From them, and I left Turkey with more money than I had when I got there. And so, when you
Also finance the next step?
Yes, exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, thank you. Courtney?
Hi, thank you. Just a question, if I may, about your personal, kind of your heart, where you are now. Where are you in your spiritual journey, I guess, now?
That's a really good question, because I went through, when I got to prison, and especially the solitary confinement part of it, I went through a sort of a crisis of faith, because I had really, prior to going to prison, been focusing on the social justice aspect of things and not very much on my relationship with God, and I had to ask myself, what do I really believe? And I kind of went through a process of rebuilding, of deconstruction and rebuilding my faith, and I sort of came to the realization that I needed to, be a real religious person if I was going to be anything, and that, this sort of, seeing religion as sort of a ideological social justice movement is not something to base your spirituality on, and it's not a relationship with God. it's an attempt to sort of fix the world. You know, it's a actually very materialistic and worldly type of outlook, and that doesn't really sustain you when you get into situations like, you know, like prison. So, you know, I kind of alluded to the fact that no one had, you know, when I first became Muslim, no one ever stopped me and said, hey, you know, you need to really reevaluate and take a second look at why you're even in this religion at all, you know, because, and that's what I pretty much did. And I wouldn't say that I got into Sufism, but I kind of took that very introspective approach, and I think that approach is one of the things that can inoculate people against being manipulated into, you know, going off on emotional, emotions to do things that they'll later regret, you know.
Next. Okay. Evan?
First of all, thanks for coming.
Sure, thank
I have a two-part question, if that's all right.
Sure.
First off, given how important it seems like advice from people you knew was so critical, and I also understand you're not, you know, involved in this stuff now, how do you think the role of the internet has changed in radicalization? And the second part is that, given that interpersonal communication, you know, is so important for radicalization, that creates a tension sort of with liberalism in our society. And I'm wondering if you think the proper response to that is more illiberalism, clamping down, or the opposite, more liberalism, getting more people to talk to people who might be radicalized.
For the second question, keep the mic if you could, because I'm actually, for the second question, I'm going to ask you to elaborate.
Sure.
Tell me what the first question was again?
So the first question
I started
was,
thinking so much about that deep
the first question was how the role of the internet has changed.
Oh, okay. Well, look, the way I look at this is that, you know, it's really analogous to the problem of pornography, because, you know, prior to the internet, you had like the Playboy at the 7-Eleven, you know, and after the internet, you know, we know what's out there, you know. Well, it's very similar to the problem of radicalization, because, you know, prior to the internet, really it was very, very difficult to come across these sort of ideas, you know. I mean, it was kind of much more on a person-to-person level, you know. For example, Richard Reed, you know, he became radicalized through, you know, when he became Muslim in prison and encountered someone in prison, and then, you know, met some people in London, and, you know, so that it was all interpersonal. Whereas now, you know, it's basically, you know, the radical ideological version of crack, you know, because it's just there, you know, it's there all the time as much as you want. And, you know, I was in prison from 2003 to 2016, and so I started seeing, in the later years of my imprisonment, we started getting people coming in who had been radicalized on the internet. And these type of people are of an entirely different order than those from the, you know, earlier years from when I was in prison, because these people are young people who really mostly had no idea or understanding of Islam at all. So with people from, you know, the older generation, these were people who were like, at least had been around mosques and stuff, you know, at least had heard something of actual traditional Islam that you could like appeal to, you know, the sources of Islam to say, hey, you know, your understanding is mistaken. This is what Islam really says. Because, by the way, I believe that Islam you know, definitely more knowledge of traditional Islam is actually better for these kind of people, you know, because, you know, even though people have their critiques of the Islamic religion, and I'm not afraid of that, you know, or you know, I don't take offense at that. Nevertheless, it remains the fact that Islam itself can be used to argue very forcefully against the ISIS interpretation. Even though, you know, and this is getting off on a slight tangent, but even though people like Graham Wood have, you know, understandably come to the conclusion that ISIS is somehow actually Islamic, I think that's actually the completely mistaken. And we can talk about later about why that is. But in any event, when you talk to these younger people who have become radicalized on the internet, most of these people have no real foundation in their religion. So when you try to talk to them and say, hey, Islam doesn't really stand for that, they don't know what you're talking about. They don't care what you're talking about. There's really no way to go to. There's no foundation for them anymore. All they know is videos of Muslim children dying at the hands of the West. That's their Islam. That's their religion. Is this is ISIS propaganda? So this is a very, very difficult problem. So that is certainly why you're seeing this exponential multiplying of of incidents and that sort of thing is the internet for sure. And I monitor these sort of extremist messages very closely.
Yes, you do.
Because it's part of my work, and that I'm doing in de-radicalization or preventing radicalization, and it's very, very difficult. Now, the second question was about liberalism. Can you elaborate a little bit more about what you mean on
Sure.
that?
So the United States is sort of a classic liberal society in the sense of the marketplace of ideas, but also sort of freedom to espouse your ideas, even bad ones.
Yeah.
I was really struck by how interpersonal communication was a big part of every step of the process, both becoming radicalized and de-radicalized.
Right.
So I was sort of wondering, given that, do you think the proper response to this is sort of to go away from liberalism, sort of clamp down on the people who are spreading these, or more liberalism, push the people who are pushing the anti-radicalization?
Yeah, I think I'm a big believer, frankly, in getting rid of this material on the internet. I don't think it should be available. You have even people who are against ISIS, like, for example, the Clarion Project, that makes ISIS propaganda available on their website for people to see, and they explain that this is in order to, expose the shocking nature of it, but at the same time, I don't think it's a good idea to make this stuff available, and I think it needs to be shut down and scrubbed from the internet. It's very, very dangerous. So I almost think that less availability of it. I'm very much for shutting down and shutting up, these people. So I think my answer is really that. I have to say. Yeah, and how do you do that with the First Amendment?
Good point.
I think that's a very good question, but I think to the greatest extent possible. I mean, they do, for example, in England, they've got Anjem Choudhury in prison, for radicalizing people, and you have the aiding and abetting statute, which is Section 2 of Title 18 of the United States Code, which criminalizes counseling other people to commit crimes. So I think that certainly anyone who is found to be, promoting ISIS propaganda online should certainly feel the threat of some sort of prosecution. And but one difficulty with that is you've got a case where someone was, at least part of their case involved retweeting something from ISIS. And I think that's where you get into, something very problematic, because I've actually retweeted stuff from ISIS saying, look at these idiots. Great job, ISIS. You blew up a water tank. How's that going to help anything? So that's the sort of thing. Now, so
we're fortunate we're not at that point, nor do we want to be. France, when I was there last time, a few months ago, has now prosecuted and sentenced the first person for visiting jihadi websites.
Yeah.
And no plot that I know of, and that person, I believe, got 4 years.
Yeah, I think that is very, very problematic. But but then you have like Samir Khan, who was in the car with, Anwar al-Awlaqi when they, blew up his car and from a drone. And I'm not lamenting his death. I say there's a saying, Alhamdulillah, praise be to God who removed this problem from us. You know what I mean? So.
Who happened to be in the same car with Anwar al-Awlaki.
Right, and Anwar al-Awlaki, people, a lot of the Muslims, have this, affection for Anwar al-Awlaki, even though they may not agree with his, what he was into later. They have this mythological, romantic notion of him being this person who was speaking truth to power and stuff. In reality, this person was, Anwar, and he's, by the way, Anwar al-Awlaki is intimately connected with my case, as I just tweeted something this morning about that. But in any event, this is a person who was calling on Muslims in the West to kill any American non-Muslim that he could find. So, this is a person who, can hardly complain about being blown up. So, and then you have Muslims saying, oh, they killed Imam Anwar just for what he was saying. No. He live by the sword, die by the sword. So I don't lament these people being, blown up, or killed where they were. The Muslims should have done it instead of the United States. That's how I look at it.
Okay, we'll take one more from Carol.
My question
Hang on
is-
one sec.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You obviously have a brilliant mind
Thank you.
and a story to be told.
Yeah.
And when you said your work, what type of work do you see as your future?
Well, right now, my overarching, my life is a history or a series of causes that I just can't get away with. I can't get away from it. I have to just embrace that. But my cause really is twofold. One is to see the Muslims succeed again. Right now the Muslim world is mired in, it's a basket case. It's not helping itself because essentially the Muslim world is degenerating unfortunately into into a big morass, and its solution so far really seems to be, I'm generalizing, but essentially to point the finger at the West. And this is actually not the way a mature person, solves his problems, much less a civilization. So I think that the Muslim world has contributed so much to civilization in the past and can do so again, but it has to handle its problems, and extremism and radicalism is a symptom of what it's going through, not the solution. Many people, the extremists like to point to their efforts as being part of an awakening of the Muslim world, but in reality, it's actually part of the degeneration of the Muslim world. So, more broadly speaking, I would like to see, my goal and my cause now is really the coexistence of the Muslims with Western civilization. Because in the past, all we have to do is look at the great civilization of the Mediterranean to see what is possible through interchange between the Muslim. We know that we have the Muslims' translations of Aristotle, and then the seeds of the Renaissance being in the rediscovery of Aristotle and the Greek philosophers through that, and so that this sort of exchange is and you have coming out of that things like Fibonacci and people like Fibonacci and all these great fruits from the interchange between the Muslim world and the West. And I see Islam as being part of the great Western tradition, because there's no question that there's a great debt the Muslims owe to the Greek civilization, for their many of their successes. So I just think that, just to illustrate, I wrote an essay saying exactly this, and I gave it to John Walker Lind, who is known as the American Taliban guy, to review. And I wrote a line in there saying, there is no bright line between Islam and the West. And he crossed that out and wrote, yes, there is. It's iman and kufr, which means faith and disbelief. You know what I mean? And this is exactly the wrong way of looking at it. You know what I mean? There's, and people this is one example of how so-called fundamentalism is in reality, and extremism is in reality wants to erase a great part of the tradition, you know, in the Muslim world. And so I think embracing the real tradition and the real history, you know, is part of the cure for this, you know, degeneration and the symptoms of extremism.
Ismail, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.